Hello there, and welcome to lesson 3. Believe it or not, this lesson will actually be our last lesson on the Romantics. Of our 10 lessons, we're doing 3 lessons on the Romantics, 4 on the Victorians, because that was such a long and influential time period, and then 3 lessons on the 20th century to the present. So we move through things rather quickly in a survey class like this, where we have essentially 200 years worth of literature to cover in a 10 lesson course. We move very quickly, and so it's hard to believe, even for me, that we're wrapping up the Romantics. But here we go. So I've titled this lesson The Gothics, as in part 2 we will look at the emergence of Gothic literature as a genre, but moreover, because this lesson features the final 3 of the big 6 Romantic poets. Blake, Wordsworth, and Coleridge are usually considered the first generation of Romantics, who primarily wrote their major works in the 1790s, in the first decade of the 19th century. And the second generation of Romantics is usually considered Shelley, Keats, and Byron. And they did, they're primarily their most popular writings were in the 1810s and the 1820s. And so there is sort of a generational age gap there between the two sets of 3 writers. And what I'm getting at, to get back to my point, is that the second generation of Romantic writers is really known for exploring the darker side of Romanticism, the darker sublime. And so there's really a Gothic element throughout the works of the major writers. But in addition to those 3 poets, we'll also look at John Clare, who was another peasant poet like Robert Burns, and we'll look at Mary Shelley, after Jane Austen, the most well-known female writer of the Romantic period, and with Frankenstein, wrote what I would argue is probably the most memorable, most significant, definitely the most influential work of the entire Romantic period. So I'm very excited to end this series with part 4 of this lecture on Mary Shelley. We'll also look at the Gothic genre and Anne Radcliffe, one of the female Gothic novelists, and how there's this relationship between the highly canonical Romantic poets I've already mentioned, and then the Gothic novels that those highly canonical poets tended to regard as literature for the masses and more lowbrow literature. So we'll look at that relationship between the two. But what's interesting is that the more highbrow writers incorporated all of these Gothic elements into their work. And so that's why I've titled this lesson The Gothics, is that's really a theme throughout the majority of the texts we're looking at in this lesson. So for the first part, we're going to look at 2 poets, John Keats and John Clare. And Keats is one of those 6 major writers. And of the second generation, he's probably the least Gothic, the most approachable, relatable of that second generation of big Romantic poets. But we're primarily going to look at his short poetry, and so I've decided to pair him with another writer, John Clare, because with both we're looking at short poetry. So in one sense, we have time to look at both of them in one part of a lesson, but also 2 other reasons. One, they do have some commonalities we'll mention, but then 2, the differences between them will help illustrate kind of that difference I've been talking about, of how these 6 Romantic writers, even during their own day, were seen as set apart from everyone else writing at this time. And so John Clare represents the everyman, the working class poet, whereas John Keats, although he's the least academic and least stuffy of these 3 final poets, just as a juxtaposition, represents that difference, where in his time and today he was, like those other 5 big writers, regarded as the best of the Romantic period. Yet at the same time, there were people like John Clare. They were peasant poets. They were Gothic novelists doing really great writing that has so much value. And today, fortunately, we can look back and see that value, but scholars don't always think of it that way. So here we go. We're going to start with John Clare first. He's an example of what the textbook calls an untaught primitive genius. And we talked about the glorification of the ordinary in Romanticism. So in response to the Enlightenment and all this highly philosophical writing that came the decades before the emergence of Romanticism, the popular writers of the day really wanted to find writers who came from the working class rather than the upper class. And so Robert Burns, who we studied in the first lesson, is one example of this peasant poet who was self-taught rather than receiving a fancy education. And they're both examples of this type of self-educated peasant poet. But Clare is really the closest thing you get to a natural poet of the time, even more so than Burns. Compared to Burns, he had only enough education to read and write. He basically wasn't illiterate. Whereas Burns, even though Burns was from the working class, he did get some formal education. And Clare's mother was illiterate, and his father was a field laborer, and he worked most of his young life in the fields with his father. And he's also, as we'll talk about more in a minute, known for using crasser, more vulgar language and not being worried about punctuation and grammar and things. So he's really just this salt of the earth type of poet. And that's really what sets him apart and makes him interesting and appealing. So he worked very hard in the fields with his father as a child, and would sneak away or do whatever he could to kind of find time to write poetry. And he said that composing verse or composing poetry, he just had to do it. He had to get away to do it because it was a downright pleasure and enabled him to give vent to his feelings. And just to illustrate the class differences here, one thing I thought was interesting in studying Clare was that a blank notebook to write his poetry could cost him a week's wages. So he really lived this life of really hard-working labor growing up, and he would sneak away whenever he could to write poetry. He would, save all his money. He did earn his wages to buy notebooks to write the poetry. So really gives you a good picture here of what it was like to be a peasant poet or a working class poet compared to, say, someone like Wordsworth or Coleridge. His first published book of verse was called Poems Descriptive of Rural Life and Scenery, and he published it in 1820, and it sold quite well. It was pretty popular. Again, because writers like Wordsworth were looking for these untaught primitive geniuses. They wanted to glorify the ordinary, and one way to do that was to find ordinary, I would say that in quotes, poets like Clare, and then celebrate their poetry. So after this first volume sold well, he did take a trip to London, even though he spent most of his life in the countryside. And writers like Wordsworth, the leading writers of the day, celebrated him when he arrived in London. However, after that, his next, I think, 2 books of poetry did not sell well, and he ended up being diagnosed with madness and spent the latter part of his life in an asylum. But the textbook mentions how that wasn't necessarily a negative thing. He was allowed to write, and so it really freed him up. He didn't have to continue to live this working class life, and so he actually produced some of his best, or at least most interesting poetry when he was in the asylum, which I found fascinating, and I'm glad that he didn't have a totally unhappy life. And the last thing I'll mention is, I alluded to earlier, this controversy over the grammar, the syntax, the spelling in his poems. It was never what one would consider what Wordsworth would consider completely proper English, and then that only increased more once he was in the asylum. And so his publisher at the time did some editing, some emendations to make his writing more appealing, more readable, because it was mainly the middle class and upper class who were reading his poetry, because the working class, many of them were still illiterate, like his mother. And so his editor did make these changes. And he was not a fan of that. He was appreciative of his editor, and he was thankful to his editor for helping him be successful, but he didn't like the idea of, his grammar being changed to match a certain standard. He said, and I actually have this quote in my rubric on your essay assignments in the grammar section, but he called grammar um, tyrannical and said, "Confound the bitch, I'll never be her slave." So that gives you kind of an idea of his feeling about having his grammar edited to fit what a mainstream middle class reading audience would want to see. And I think it's not just about grammar, it's really a class thing. Um, John Clare represented this working class, this peasant poet, and he didn't want his writing changed to cater to a more middle class audience. And this is still controversial to this day. The versions of his poems we have in our textbook are the edited ones, to make them readable to people like you and me, and to undergraduates who are the primary people reading Norton anthologies. Uh, but there's still scholars who think Clare should only be read the way he originally wrote his poems. And so a number of scholars put together a 9-volume collection of his poems for Oxford University Press that maintain the original, I guess you would call it non-proper grammar and syntax and spelling. So I don't think you necessarily need to go out and read those versions of his poems, but keep in mind this class struggle that very much characterized his poetry, and the hypocrisy to a certain extent of the leading writers of the day who came from the upper class and wanted to glorify the ordinary, but um, didn't necessarily want to preserve it in this rural dialect and improper, grammar and spelling and syntax that he used. All right, so I thought for this lesson that we would look at the Badger. I think that's the longest, most interesting of the poems I assigned for Clare. Keep in mind, since this is really only the second time um, since the lecture on Blake that we've looked at short lyric poetry. So typically when we do that, I'll assign more poems than I'll cover in a lecture. And if we were in a classroom, we would vote as a class basically which ones to spend time discussing, but probably again not have time to look at all of them. And so um, what you can do then, or what I hope you do, is that while you can certainly do your threads and thesis post on the same poem that I discussed in the lecture, you can also go to those other poems. I'd like you to still read them. There'd be a lot of interesting content, interesting ideas you can pull out of those. So these threads I have here, these interesting observations that I'm going to use to launch our discussion are on the Badger. The first thing I want to point out is this difference I've been emphasizing since the biography, which is this peasant poet versus what I would call high romantic. High romantic being those 6 most famous poets who wrote in standard English, and who clearly, if you've been reading Clare for this lesson, have a very different style. And so I call that Wordsworthian romanticism. I think the association of Wordsworth as stuffy fits with the the way I'm trying to encapsulate my description of those highly canonical romantic poets. And the key difference, in my opinion, is that the focus in the writing of Clare or someone like him is external. For instance, in the Badger, he's describing the process of badger baiting. and how awful it is. And you don't really get an in-depth look at the psychology of the speaker or the poet. Whereas Wordsworth, when he interacts with nature, which we saw the perfect example in I Wandered Lonely as a Cloud, the experience with imagining he's a cloud and seeing the daffodils, the entire purpose of that is to show the psychology of the speaker. You get in the final stanza of I Wandered Lonely as a Cloud, where he talks about when he's feeling vacant, he can go um, to these memories. And really, Wordsworth's writing is characterized by the prelude, which was his long, epic poem he spent his entire life writing. And that entire poem is about his psychology, or the psychology of the speaker of the poem, and how his mind changes and develops over time through his interactions with nature. You don't get any of that internal psychology with Claire. It's all external, which the psychology can be very interesting, but to me, after a while, it becomes self-glorification. Whereas I think Claire is really doing something significant here in the way he depicts badger baiting. I think you can make a stronger argument against badger baiting, or a stronger pro-nature argument, perhaps, through this external view, where the focus is really on the subject of the poem more so than the speaker's psychology. To just kind of drive this idea home a little bit more, Claire is really just depicting the nature rather than, like I said, the psychology of the speaker. And again, to reiterate this external focus, I think if you studied eco-criticism or environmental literature, I think this external focus is just more conducive to an environmental reading. But much of the writing, much of romanticism and much of transcendentalism in the US, which are the authors so often associated with environmental literature because they talk so much about nature, so much of that, Wordsworth. And then in America, uh, Thoreau, Emerson, and Whitman, so much of that focuses on the psychology of the speaker rather than the nature. I think we have something interesting and unique here with Claire. And if you look up the scholarship on Claire, if you research him at all, you'll see this is reflected in the scholarship a lot. Claire is getting a lot more critical attention now, particularly from eco-critical scholars, and has actually kind of become more canonical in the last 10 to 15 years with the development of eco-criticism, because of his external focus on the nature rather than internal focus on his own psychology. Um, so we're going to look at a couple different short sections of the badger here to illustrate how this external focus furthers an environmental reading. So there's one description of the badger where he says, though scarcely half as big to mute and small, he fights with dogs for hours and beats them all. So this is really, really brutal practice of the early 19th century that was popular then, where it would be similar to cockfighting or dogfighting today, where it's just brutal and awful treatment of animals, but they would release these dogs and have the badger fight them. And so what this poem is really about is Claire's critique, his criticism of that practice. But in this line, he's drawing sympathy for the badger. It's a very external observation. He's for the most part just describing what's happening, but with a few well-placed adjectives, he's able to draw sympathy for the badger that is holding its own despite being smaller and weaker. It's holding its own, or at least for a while, against these dogs. So as the reader, that makes you really want to root for the badger. And then you just have the way it ends is just so tragic here. He falls as dead and kicked by boys and men, then starts and grins and drives the crowd again. Till kicked and torn and beaten out he lies, and leaves his hold and cackles, groans, and dies. So again, he holds his own for as long as he can and eventually dies. So by this point in the poem, you have so much sympathy for the badger that it's quite tragic. And so to me, this is a great case for environmental literature. But here you have no interiority at all. It's all focused on the badger himself. So some of the things I really get from this is the complexity of human and animal interactions. Why does badger baiting? Why did it exist? Why does dog fighting exist? Um, the relationship between human and animals is really a fascinating one, and I think Clare really explores that here in an interesting way that perhaps Wordsworth or poets like him are not able to do because they're so focused on themselves. And there's a subfield within eco-criticism called animal studies that really explores this. And to continue to get at the question of why does something as awful as badger baiting even exist, I read an article in preparing for this lesson on the poem, and the critic argues that enclosure actually had an influence here. And so, if you remember from the very first lesson in the background on Romanticism, enclosure is what one thing that happened during the Romantic period where the government started to close off pieces of land that actually used to be open to the public. And it led to a lot of poverty in the countryside because people would actually use that land to get food, to get apples from trees, or, that's just one example. Jane Austen has a scene in one of her novels where a poor rural laborer climbs over a fence to get into an enclosed area to get apples from a tree. And so enclosure really shaped rural life during this time. And this critic of this article I read argues that enclosure created a distance between humans and animals, whereas before enclosure, a lot of the working class people who were typically the people taking part in badger baiting would have worked more closely alongside animals and had a natural closeness to animals as part of that rural environment. But once an enclosure happened, not as many people worked alongside animals. And so there was a kind of a distancing between human and animals that would make perhaps people less sympathetic to animals and more likely to participate in something like badger baiting. So I just wanted to bring that in and share it as a way to kind of help understand and interpret this poem and get at its significance. Um, and so I'll end with the thought of animals should be accounted among those affected by the sweeping cultural changes of the Romantic period. In other words, we've talked, especially when we're talking about Scott, we've talked about the Industrial Revolution and how the Romantic period, one reason why it was so intense and so much writing was produced in such a short period of time were these sweeping cultural changes. And enclosure is a prime example of that. So it's important to remember that those sweeping changes affected animals as well as humans, and Claire's poem illustrates that. All right, so now we're going to transition and look at John Keats and compare highly canonical romantic poets to type of peasant poet we just looked at. Keats, though, is a really interesting figure. Um, I paired him with Claire because from him we're mainly reading short poems, whereas Shelley and Byron were looking at longer works. But of that second generation of romantics, Keats is really my favorite. He just has some beautiful short poems, and he was a really sympathetic figure. He didn't get so caught up in his own self-image and self-glorification the way Byron and Shelley did. And to me, there's just a naturalness about his poetry that makes him very compelling. So to illustrate my point about the differences between the high romanticism and the peasant poets, Shelley or Byron probably would have been a better choice, but they are just more famous for their longer works. And Keats's short works, his short lyric poems, are really, really beautiful. So it just made sense to kind of put together the two poets who were looking at shorter works by them. So Keats, by contrast from Clare, had a really thorough education as he was growing up, and he actually received mentorship. His schoolmaster was a fairly accomplished poet and saw his poetry at an early age and encouraged him. But then his mother died, and his father was already dead, and so his guardian um, basically made him become an apprentice to a surgeon, and so he wasn't able to, at least for a short period, continue on with the poetry. And he did well, though, as an apprentice to a surgeon. In 1816, um, he qualified to become an apothecary surgeon in 1816 at the age of 21. But once his apprenticeship was over, he had the freedom to say, I'm done, I'm going back to poetry. And this greatly disappointed his guardian, but he was, for the rest of his short lived life, the next 5 years, able to just focus on his poetry. And he was introduced to a very sympathetic and appreciative audience. He worked with Shelley and really Leigh Hunt, who is not as accomplished as Shelley or Byron or these other poets we're looking at, but was a moderately successful romantic poet, became friends with Keats and introduced him to people like Shelley. And so he had kind of this group of writers who collaborated and helped him. Um, but he always had a sense that he would die young. He had this medical background, and so any issues he had, he was able to self diagnose. And his mother and his brother both died of tuberculosis. So he had a sense that perhaps tuberculosis was coming. Um, and so he wrote with a sense of urgency and produced a high volume of poetry in what was really just 5 years. Whereas an adult, he was mainly writing poetry. One of the things he valued was individuality, which sets him apart from Byron and Shelley and the other romantics of the time. He thought if he received too much mentorship from people like Hunt and Shelley, that his poetry would be seen as tainted to a certain extent, I guess you could say, as people would consider a product of him working with these other poets. So he broke off from this circle of romantic writers. One thing that's interesting and was really a mark of the Romantic period is you had these writers collaborating together who knew each other. Wordsworth and Coleridge, Byron and Shelley are examples. But Keats didn't want to be part of that circle of writers who were working together. He wanted to be his own individual. Um, So a number of important dates coming up where over that 5 year period of writing, he made some major achievements. One is the idea of negative capability. um, this came out in his letters, and it's similar to what we talked about with Wordsworth in the preface to Lyrical Ballads and Coleridge in Biographia Literaria, where Keats came up with his own theory for writing poetry that also today serves us as a theory for analyzing poetry. And if this were a critical theory class, you would be reading Keats's letters in it and learning about negative capability. But Keats described what he calls negative capability and what he believes the goal of all poets should be as a capacity of great writers to pursue artistic beauty even when it leads them into intellectual confusion and uncertainty. So the thing that's really interesting about Keats, what drives his poetry and makes it compelling, is he becomes completely consumed by the subject matter. And I would call this like an organic muse type of approach to poetry. Just completely immerses himself in the poetry and lets it go where it takes him. Whereas the other romantic poets, as much as they immersed themselves in nature, often they were still very systematic in their approach to writing and took a less of an organic approach, I think is the best word to describe it. And so for Keats, it's really about just immersing yourself in the subject matter and seeing where it takes you. And he calls that negative capability because you don't know where it's going to lead. It's uncertain, it's confusing. So it's highly capable, it's a good thing, but negative as in you don't understand it, I guess would be the way to put that. Um, and so this was the driving force for Keats in his poetry. And as we look at his poems in a few minutes, we'll see how that's reflected, how his vision here, his goal of negative capability manifests in his poetry. um, so continuing with the important dates, the first mention of negative capability was in a letter he wrote in 1817. Continuing with these important dates, in 1818, he published his first significant amount of poetry, and he received really negative reviews. A lot of these were politically motivated because Leigh Hunt had been his mentor, and Leigh Hunt was very politically radical. And so many of the reviewers took a negative stance on Keats solely because of his associations with Leigh Hunt rather than even his own political views. And so this is just a prime example of why he wanted to distance himself from the romantic circle of writers and why he wanted to be his own individual. And those reviews, really stuck with him. I think they were pretty influential, and some of the later writers have commented on that. But he also met and fell in love with Fanny Braun, um, who was the love of his life, and so they only knew each other for 3 years before he died. It's quite tragic. There's actually a great movie about his relationship with Fanny Braun called Bright Star. You should check it out if you're interested in Keats. Um, it's sad, but it's beautiful, much like his poem Bright Star, which I've included. And they chose that title for the movie because it really fits, as Keats was this very bright, brilliant star that just burned out too quickly. That concept so encapsulates his literary career. Um, Finally, in 1819, he went on and wrote more poetry, and these works are really considered his masterpieces. He's best known for his odes, which we'll look at: Ode on a Grecian Urn, um, Ode to a Nightingale, To Autumn. The ode's a specific genre of poetry, which if we had more time, we'd get into, but type of poem where the speaker focuses on a specific object and pays tribute to it. It's an ode. And so he was really famous for those, and he produced many of them in 1819. And also some longer poems we're not looking at, but also that were praised. He did that year. And then finally in 1821, he finally succumbed to the tuberculosis that had claimed other members of his family and that he had predicted for himself. Okay, so we're going to look at his poem, Ode on a Grecian Urn. In many ways, this is Keats's masterpiece because with the different images on the urn, it really encapsulates his idea of negative capability and his poetic vision, more so than any of his other short lyric poems. I'm also going to talk a little bit about Ode to a Nightingale. We'll do the close reading of Ode on a Grecian Urn, but in many ways, Ode on a Nightingale is representative of the type of poems he consistently wrote, where you see some of the negative capability, the completely immersing oneself in the subject matter. But Ode on a Grecian Urn takes that a step further, and so I'll be talking about both poems, but the close reading will be of a Grecian urn, and you'll see why as we go through it. But I only have one thread here to explore. And I think this idea is really central to understanding Keats and really central to understanding all of Romanticism. And Keats asked, how do we live in a world that is full of misery and heartbreak, pain, sickness, and oppression? I mean, he saw so much of it as he saw his family members die and knew that he would die young. And in his poems, you really see his fear that he would die young. He even has one I didn't assign called Fears That I May Cease to Be. And so he knew the misery and heartbreak, pain, sickness, and oppression of the world well. And I think this is a theme we've seen all throughout Romanticism. All of the Romantics have acknowledged that we live in a fallen and broken world, and they've all proposed different solutions for how to deal with it. And so Keats's solution is his negative capability. Let's take a look at how he does that in the poem. So we're going to look at the last stanza from Ode on a Grecian Urn, and I've split it in half. It's 10 lines, so we're going to look at 5 lines and then another 5 lines. And in the first 5 lines of it, he says, O Attic shape, fair attitude with breed, of marble men and maidens overwrought, with forest branches and the trodden weed, thou silent form dost tease us out of thought, as doth eternity cold pastoral. So let's see what these lines mean. Marble men and maidens overwrought. That line really encapsulates what's going on in the entire poem, because the poem is a collection of images on this earth. And so these images to go back to the question about the pain and suffering of the world, these images represent a paradox. They're free from time in one sense. On this urn, they don't necessarily know the pain of the world. They can be um, in this happy moment, free from time. But at the same time, they're also frozen in time. And so you have the maiden and the men reaching out for each other, but they can't quite touch each other. They're frozen in that moment. They can't go anywhere else. So is it a good or bad thing? There's positive and negative sides to it. Um, the one hand, they don't necessarily know the pain, the sickness, the oppression of the world. On the other hand, they don't get to experience the joys of the world. And this is really such a crucial point for Keats and the Romantics, because the Romantics saw all of the oppression, all of the hard living, all of the sweeping social changes during their life, and acknowledged that we lived in a fallen and broken world, but they threw themselves into nature. And so they saw that there was something really great to appreciate about this fallen and broken world. And that's the paradox. It's the juxtaposition of, for Keats, knowing that he would die young, but still, because he had been alive, getting to have this beautiful love with Fanny Braun for just 3 years. It's the juxtaposition of how fleeting life is, but how amazing life is at the same time. And perhaps how fleeting it is helps us appreciate it even more if we know it's not permanent. So let's look at the second half of that stanza. When old age shall this generation waste, thou shalt remain in midst of other woe, then ours a friend a man, to whom thou sayest, beauty is truth, truth beauty, that is all. You know on earth, and you all need to know, and all you need to know. Sorry, I totally butchered that last line. You should read it again. Pause it and read it again on your own. Um, this is Keats's most famous poem for another reason, in addition to the ones I've already mentioned, and that's this final line here that says, beauty is truth, truth beauty. So this line is probably the most famous one in all of Keats. And there's a question here of the two lines are really important because the urn speaks and says beauty is truth, truth beauty, and that's kind of what you see on the urn throughout. But then, not in quotation marks, it says ye know on earth and all you need to know. So all we need to know is beauty is truth and truth beauty. But who is saying this? That's the question that critics have debated for years, and there's no real consensus. But the way I see it, there's two ways to look at it. One is the speaker is talking to the urn, and if that's true, then he's acknowledging the limitations of the urn. He's saying all you can know is beauty is truth, because you're frozen in time. And so the urn experiences beauty as truth without knowing the pain and the suffering of the world. If the speaker is talking to the urn in the final line, then it's an ignorance is bliss kind of a thing. But you could also be the urn talking to the speaker, and then you get kind of a different perspective. In that case, you have the urn teaching the speaker perhaps an important lesson, saying, you as a human know all of the pain and suffering of the world, but you need to focus on the beauty. You need to see through that and focus on the beauty and fully immerse yourself in the beauty, because beauty is truth. So there's two ways to look at it. If the speaker is talking to the urn, it's an ignorance is bliss kind of idea. If the urn is talking to the speaker, then the urn is teaching the speaker an important lesson about beauty being truth. All right, so here's my answer. And you can interpret it either way, as well as a plethora of other ways. And I think there's textual support for all of those. But my opinion is that the urn is talking to the speaker and it's teaching the lesson that beauty is truth. And here are my reasons why. For Keats, a delight at the sheer existence of things outside himself, the ability of the poet to seemingly lose his own identity in a total identification with the object he contemplates, that's negative capability. That's the goal of poetry, in Keats's opinion. So that doesn't really happen. That's what Keats wanted to do with poetry, and that doesn't really happen if the speaker is talking to the urn, because ignorance is bliss doesn't really fit with that. Um, you have to know the pain and suffering of the world in order to appreciate what is good about the world, and in order to see why one should completely immerse themselves in um, the subject of the poem. So, in this sense, the urn speaking to the speaker represents the poetic embodiment of Keats's theory of negative capability. Um, but here you really have the theory of negative capability fully fleshed out, because the urn, unlike the nightingale, is a fictional creation. So to compare here, the Nightingale poem, Ode to a Nightingale, is a good example of how Keats goes further into nature than any of his contemporaries and really just immerses himself in the subject matter. And this poem is really about the nightingale. Um, but it doesn't necessarily teach us that truth is beauty. What poem does teach us that is Ode on a Grecian Urn, because you take this urn, you have three different images the speaker tries to see and interact with, and they're frozen in time. And so the urn, through these images, teaches the speaker that truth is in beauty. So you have the Nightingale poem as kind of an example of Keats's philosophy, and then you have the Grecian urn poem that's really telling readers Keats's philosophy. And so to kind of pull all this together and wrap up with a cohesive ending thought, all of the romantic poets try to grapple with the suffering of their world. And poets like Blake and Shelley, who we'll see later in this lecture, came up with, they were political radicals and political activists, and they came up with their own religious mythologies that fit their political activism. There's a lot of interesting things we can pull from their work, but especially Blake's short poems. But Keats, I think, is just a more relatable, more accessible approach that we can all understand. And that's that the answer to the suffering of the world is finding truth and beauty, completely immersing oneself in the beautiful things of the world. That doesn't mean ignoring the pain and suffering of the world, but it means taking a step back from all of the activism and fighting against it, to just take a minute and just appreciate the beautiful things of this world, because there is so much pain and suffering. If we don't have time to also appreciate the beautiful things, we're losing a great truth. And those beautiful things can give us the power and ability to carry on amidst the suffering. So those are my thoughts on Keats and his philosophy and how it plays out in his poetry.